Hi, friends. We're here. We made it. It is time for the last chapter of Pax. If you have any suggestions for me on what to read next, please let me know. Um, Otherwise, I think I'll just work on finishing The Wild Robot and The Wild Robot Escapes until I have a good idea of what interest there is for another chapter book. And both dogs, I had this looking presentable behind me, but both dogs have decided that they're gonna join us like usual and make what I call a nest out of our blankets and pillows there. Let's go ahead and get into chapter 34, which, like I said, I believe is the last chapter. Yes. And then I will probably read the acknowledgements and might even give you a little sneak peek into the next book as well. Chapter 34. Peter held what was left of the fox high above his head and called his name again, Pax! And from above the mill, an answering bark. Hope rose in his throat, but no. He must have just wished for that bark. He scanned the ridgeline anyway. A flash of red. A white-tipped brush. A fox appeared in an open spot and rose on his back legs. On two back legs? And looked straight at him. Peter pressed the fox leg into his father's hand. Bury this. Then he grabbed his other crutch and turned for the hill. Wait, Peter, you have to understand. It's my duty. Peter pointed to the fox on the ridge. He thumped his chest so hard it hurt. That's mine. His father shouted to him about wires. He shouted at him to stop. Peter saw the wires. He pulled over them, but he did not stop, because there was only his fox waiting on the spine of the hill, and the distance between them. Over and over, he planted his crutches and swung through, closing the distance. When he was almost there, his shirt dried from the wind and then soaked again in sweat. He stopped and called. Pax tossed his head and then bounded away toward the trees. On four legs, Peter was sure of it. Pax was unharmed. Peter followed, but again, just as he neared him, Pax broke away, galloping into the trees. Peter followed again. He didn't begrudge Pax this testing game. He had broken his pet's trust. Why wouldn't he be skittish? Why wouldn't he need to assure himself of Peter's loyalty now? For as long as Pax wanted, Peter would obey. It was fair punishment. Through the trees, 100 long yards and 100 more, Peter followed. And then they broke into a clearing, and the fox stood and waited. Peter reached him. He offered his hand. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Pax locked Peter's gaze and then took his wrist in his jaws. Peter's pulse jumped against the bracelet of teeth, pressed just tight enough to claim him, just tight enough to call to Peter's own wildness. Two, but not two. Pax released Peter's wrist and tore across the clearing toward a crooked tree. Circling the tree was a pair of coyotes. Pax lunged at the taller one. No, Pax, come back! The tree was so far away, 50 yards at least. Peter dug his crutches into the turf and piped hard. When he was a dozen yards away, he saw the coyote's treed quarry, another fox, bright-furred with a sharp and delicate face, a vixen. She was bleeding from a gash on her haunch, and instead of a thick brush, she thrashed the blackened whip of her tail. The vixen swiped at one of the coyotes from above, taunting him, and Pax snapped at the other's flank. Peter saw that the two foxes were a team, and that they were no match for the coyotes. Peter barreled for the tree, shouting, but the coyotes ignored him. The taller of the two spun around and sank his teeth into Pax's neck. Pax shrieked, and Peter roared in fury. He braced himself on one crutch and leaned back and side-armed the other, heavy with its white ash bat. But as hard as he could, aiming in between the two coyotes. Both of them wheeled around the outrage. While the tree rang with the bat's blow, the tall, dark one sprinted away and disappeared into the brush. The other one bolted a dozen yards and then stopped and turned back. He eyed Peter and bared his fangs. Peter bared his teeth back. Pax growled at his side, hackles raised, ready to spring. Peter swept his second crutch over his head and roared again, and Pax snarled, and the pale coyote reared back in surprise. He turned and crashed out of the clearing. Peter clutched the tree. He slid to the ground, shaking. Instantly, Pax was on him, wriggling under his neck, licking his face, sniffing his broken foot, nuzzling his face again. Peter wrapped his arms around the fox and pressed his face to the piney-smelling fur. "You're okay, you're okay, you're okay." The vixen leaped over them to the ground and disappeared into the juniper scrub, ringing the clearing. Pax sat up and barked to her from Peter's lap. After a moment, Pax saw a black muzzle point out from the brush. Out came a skinny fox, about the size Pax had been at 8 months, blinking in the sunlight. He stumbled into the clearing on 3 legs. The vixen reemerged. She paced and yipped at the runty little fox, shooting weary looks at Peter. Pax squirmed out of Peter's arms and barked again. The 3-legged fox took a few steps closer. Its limp was so awkward, Peter realized he must have lost the leg only recently, and then made the connection. He offered his hand and called softly. Hesitatingly, his gaze darting between Peter and Pax, the little fox hobbled over. He tucked his head under Pax's chin. Peter extended a finger. The injured fox allowed him to brush his neck for an instant, then hurried back to the safety of the vixen's side. Together, the 2 foxes looked expectantly at Pax, and then they melted into the underbrush, and Peter understood. His fox belonged to them, and they belonged to Pax, inseparable. All this way he'd come, all this way. Peter got to his knees. He placed his hand on Pax's back and felt the muscles jump. Peter looked around. The woods looked dangerous now, full of coyotes and bears, and soon humans at war. He looked down at his fox, still straining to follow his new family. "Go. It's okay." It wasn't, though. The pain scoured him hollow, left him without breath, like a kick to the heart. He pulled his hand away because Pax would feel a pain that deep, and he wouldn't leave. "Go." That picture. Pax shot away toward the brush line. Then he turned back to look at his boy. Peter felt tears roll down his face, but he didn't wipe them away. Pax sprang back. He whimpered, licking at the tears. Peter pushed him down. He found the crutch and levered himself upright. "No, I don't want you to stay. I'll always leave the porch door open, but you have to go." Pax looked toward the brush, and then back at his boy's face. Peter dug into his pocket and pulled out the toy. He lifted it. Pax raised his head, his eyes trained on Peter's hand. And Peter hurled the plastic soldier over the brush and into the woods, as far away as he could. Sometimes the apple rolls very far from the tree. What do you think that note is about or from? Who wrote that? Okay, before I read acknowledgements and a little taste of the sequel book, let's go ahead and cover the last 3 questions of our story. Whew, I didn't think I was going to make it through that without crying. Yes, that's what I meant. Chapter 34 questions, number 1. Why does Pax keep running away from Peter? Question 2. How does Peter help Pax? And lastly, how does Peter let Pax know it is okay for him to go with Bristle and Runt? Okay, acknowledgements from our author, Sarah Pennypacker. Red foxes. The more I learned about them, the more I admired them, and the more determined I became to portray them with respect. I am indebted to Matthew Walter, a New York State biologist and skilled wildlife tracker, who has spent years researching red foxes in the field. Where the fox behavior is accurate, it's because he generously shared his expertise. Where it's not, I've made a choice to serve the needs of the story. I urge readers to do their own research about this splendid animal. Without the following people, Pax would still be a room full of crumpled pages. My kids, who, although grown, continue to remind me of the extraordinary bonds possible between children and animals. My writing groups, North and South, smart, insightful writers, who don't tolerate lazy sentences. My agent, Stephen Malk, who understood and loved this book from the day I shared its tiny seed. My editor, Donna Bray, for her brilliant guidance. All of HarperCollins for the incredible support. Patient David for all the times I was with the foxes. And finally, Chris Crutcher, thank you for the story behind the story within the story. You know the one. And a sneak peek to the sequel, Pax Journey Home. Chapter 1 of the sequel. Pax ran. He always ran. Nearly a year after he'd last been caged, his muscles still remembered the hex wire. This morning the running was different, though. This morning the fox ran because below the hard, matted forest floor, below the crusts of snow that remained in the deepest pine shades, and below the wafers of ice lacing the puddles, he smelled it. Spring. New life surging up, up from the bark, and the buds, and the burrows. And the only possible response was go. And then suddenly he stopped. Rabbit. Bristle was always hungry these days. Pax canted toward the scent and found the warren. It had been abandoned only hours before. It held 2 kit carcasses, one dead many days, one lifeless a single night. This was the 3rd place in as many days that Pax had come upon dead young. The first a field mouse burrow, held an entire litter. He had brought home the freshest body, but Bristle's snout wrinkled in disgust. The second was a chipmunk nest. Bristle had refused the meal of dead pups, too. So Pax didn't bother with the rabbit kits. Instead, suddenly tired, he turned for the deserted farm that he, Bristle, and Runt had claimed since leaving the place where Runt had lost his leg. Bristle wasn't in sight, but she was near. He trotted along her trail to an old shed. A hole had been tunneled under its steps, freshly scraped dirt scattered all around. Pax followed her scent inside. Bristle was curled at the back of the new den, her bright fur clumped with sand. She opened one sleepy eye to her mate, then settled her face back onto her paws. Pax was baffled. The morning air was already warming and held no threat of storm. Even more perplexing, there was a scent in the den he had never encountered before. But that he knew as well as his own. It was of Bristle, but not Bristle. He nosed her neck, asking her to track the air. New? Yes, new. Us. Pax still did not understand. Bristle rolled onto her back and stretched out her round belly. Kits. Soon. Then she curled back into the clean sand. Pax watched her every breath until she fell asleep. He backed out of the den, gave a single bark, and then he ran. This time he ran because if he didn't, he would burst. And of course, we have another chapter because we need to know what's going on with Peter. Peter crouched over the offending floorboard and traced the ridge that rippled all the way down. Vola had said the boards were flat enough. He could begin sanding. But he wanted them perfect when she saw the floor finished, not just flat enough. He adjusted the wheel of the plane until the blade projected only enough to shave off veneers thin as paper. He could make a single thicker cut, but layer by layer would do a better job. Peter liked planing, maybe best of all the skills he'd learned building the cabin. The plane was a real muscle tool, not like a screwdriver, say. You used your whole body with the plane, a tool for a man, not a boy. He positioned it over the end of the board, wrapped his hand over the knob, and eased his weight onto it. Then he began to guide the plane forward with his left. The 100-year-old yellow pine, salvaged from a neighbor's barn, sheared off in an even curl that smelled as crisp as fresh-cut wood. He liked how wood was always ready to start over, and how suddenly the plane stubbed up short against a knot. Peter's pushing hand shot off the knob, and he skinned the pad of his palm. He fell back on his heels, cursing. When was he going to learn? That was how knots were, sneaky, hiding under the surface. As the blood welled up and began to trickle down his wrist, the phrase struck. Blood and sweat. He had dripped buckets of sweat all over this cabin. A little blood signature wouldn't be out of place. He pressed the cut to the board and watched a red flame leak out. The spreading stain looked like a fox's tail. Peter jerked his hand back, shocked at how hard the memory hit. Last year, on his journey back to the place where had been forced to abandon his pet fox, Pax, he'd nicked his calf so he could smear a foxtail blood oath on his leg. I will come back for you, it vowed. He pressed the wound to the center of his chest. Memories were so treacherous, always lurking under the surface, ready to bushwhack you with a blade to the heart when you weren't careful. And we are all done with Pax. I hope you enjoyed the final chapter of Pax. I hope you learned something new in the acknowledgements about our author. And I hope that you are intrigued about the sequel, Pax: A Journey Home. Thank you for joining me for this book. And thank you again to my sweet listener in California for recommending that we read this. I really enjoyed it, and I hope you did too. Thank you for joining me, and have a good day. Stay safe. See you next time. Bye.